Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon from Rome, but good morning or good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. Welcome to the launch of the Rural Development Report 2021 from the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD for short. My name is Finn, and I'll be the moderator for this event. Now, the Rural Development Report is IFAD's flagship publication, and this year we're focusing on transforming food systems for rural prosperity, which is extremely timely given that the Food Systems Summit is happening in 2 days' time. There, world leaders are going to meet to discuss what are the best ways to turn our current food systems, which, as we all know, are currently unequitable, unsustainable, unhealthy, and environmentally destructive, into food systems that work for everyone, especially people in rural areas, a majority of whom earn an income from working in small-scale agriculture. These food producers often lack security of land tenure, they don't have access to markets and financing, and they tend to be shut off from global and local discussions around tackling hunger and climate change, even though they are vital in the fight against both hunger and climate change. Now, in fact, farms of up to 2 hectares produce 31% of the world's food, despite having less than 11% of farmland, which makes them very productive. Well, we have a great event lined up today for you to discuss all these issues. We're going to have a presentation of the report's main findings, followed by an in-depth and hopefully lively discussion on how we can transform food systems for rural prosperity. We will then have some reactions from key stakeholders and Q&A with questions from the audience. First, though, we have an opening statement from IFAD's president, Gilbert Hongbo. He was unable to join us in person, but sent us a video message.
Dear friends and colleagues, today's food systems have failed to deliver the outcomes we want. Whether we look at the climate, at the environment, at nutrition or human health and well-being, our food systems are failing. The lives of more than 700 million people are blighted by hunger. Most poor and hungry people live in rural areas. Most of them earn their incomes, at least in part, from working on small farms or in other parts of the food system. They produce a large share of the food we eat. These rural people who are at the heart of IFAD's work must be front and center in transforming food systems. We have seen time and time again that when we invest in these people, real change is possible. IFAD's Rural Development Report 2021 is focused around transforming food systems for rural prosperity. It describes systemic issues that have led to the situation we are in: hunger rising, inequality worsening, and planetary disaster imminent. It identifies priorities for transforming our food systems, and it provides recommended actions to achieve meaningful change with a focus on how to improve rural people's livelihoods. Key solutions are presented, from how to create rural employment through local small enterprises to achieving a sustainable transformation of food production, to making healthy diets accessible to all. The report is launched at an auspicious moment on the eve of the United Nations Food Systems Summit. With this in mind, the report provides analysis and policy recommendations for transforming food systems so they provide nutritious food for all. And so they offer decent livelihoods for those working within them. The Rural Development Report shows us what rural people themselves have been saying during the Food Systems Summit dialogues. That is, we need to look local. Local small-scale farmers and local SMEs processing, packaging, and marketing food are the lifeblood of our food systems. By investing in them, in their farms, their markets, their businesses, we can build the food systems we need from the bottom up. We can create jobs, livelihoods, and make diverse and nutritious food available where needs are greatest. I would like to welcome you to the event and hope you find the discussion fruitful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would now like to invite Dr. Jo Puri, who has very kindly allowed me to use her shorter name to present the report's main findings. Now, Dr. Puri is Associate Vice President of IFAD's Strategy and Knowledge Department that leads the production of this report. Dr. Puri, all yours.
Thank you so much, Thin. And at the outset, let me say that in presenting this report, I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants that I'm hoping all of you will have a chance to engage with during this session to really delve deeply into some of the findings, a lot of the analysis, a lot of the data, and the recommendations that are coming out of this report, which is also IFAD's flagship report. So panning over to my presentation, which is hopefully short so that we can go over to the giants after that. What we are looking for, and as President Gilbert said as well, okay. Yeah, so clearly something isn't working, right? So there are 811 million people that are going hungry and 2.5 billion people who are insecure. And as Thin said during her summary presentation right at the beginning, the food system that we are afflicted with currently is unfair, inadequate, and definitely inefficient because it's allowing those who are producing food to go hungry. We're witnessing a huge increase in production, but we're still suffering from undernourishment, malnourishment, as well as obesity, and a scarcity of micronutrients. And it's inefficient because 1/3 of our overall greenhouse gas emissions are coming out of this sector. So clearly, we've got to fix it. The RDR, that's what it's fondly called, 2021, has a focus on rural small-scale producers. 3.2 billion people currently live in rural areas of low and middle income countries, but more than 500 million people work on less than 2 hectares of land. And guess what? Like Thin said as well, these small scale producers essentially produce on 11% of the land. So you can see my red circle there, but they produce more than 31% of the overall food that we eat. So more than 1/3 of the food that we eat, divide your plate into 3 parts, and 1/3 of that comes from small scale producers. Yeah. So they're clearly a really important and salient part of the overall global system. So I'm going to talk really about a few action areas that the Rural Development Report 2021 is focusing on, and then we can go into discussion. First, the report is saying enhance productivity of small scale farmers within planetary boundaries. How you can do this is to first shift towards nutrient-dense and diversified food production. A lot of the focus of the report is really going local. Going local means that you can focus on neglected and underutilized species that are also endemic to the areas where they're being grown by definition, but that means you're also catering to diversified tastes and preferences. The second is support nature-based solutions in knowledge-based agriculture. So we're focusing on science, but we're also saying that you use agroecological systems and nature-based solutions. And guess what? Who are the great champions in using these sorts of systems? By themselves, without a lot of incentives, small-scale producers. We've also found in the context of the pandemic that small-scale producers and farmers have been the most resilient with respect to their overall production and reaching to markets than compared to, say, many other large-scale producers. And within this, provide adoption, advisory, and adaptation services. And what I mean by that is adoption, for example, adoption of processes, insurance, new innovations takes a lot of time, but that requires that there has to be support provided to small-scale producers and farmers. Advisory work with respect to weather information, market information, financial advice has to be provided so that these farmers can be adapting. The second action area that the report is really focusing on off-farm enterprises through an investment on agri-food midstreams. This is essentially the idea that, look, value chains are long and we understand it, but most of the profits that are made currently in large global corporations, and very little of it really goes down the value chain and goes to small-scale producers. And we've got to change that. We can change that by investing in transparency, by focusing on aggregation of smaller scale producers, so that we can also benefit from the efficiency of rural and local value chains. Right? One of the key challenges that we are seeing, which is the causes of small investments in rural and small producers and farmers, is that the aggregation cost of these farmers is just very high. And transactionally, it seems to be too expensive by large corporations as well as by governments to invest in them. We've got to change that. We are also saying that there has to be leadership and strong policies and responsible principles and practices on labor rights, on gender empowerment, and environment and climate. One of the key things that is coming out is that there is a lot of washing with respect to, say, environmental, social, and governance principles. If we can focus on credible systems that can help to ensure that, yes, a lot of what is being promised by companies, we will ensure that the key advantage the small-scale producers do bring to this table is also recognized, because they are using far more transparent and good governance, good environmentally good and climatically good systems already. And then we're also saying focus on agribusiness incubators, both as a source of employment, but also as a source of building small and medium enterprises. This also helps to build skills and provide access to new technologies. The third action area is really on social protection. One of the key recognitions of the pandemic has been to bring to fore the fact that, look, to not have people be left behind, we do have to look to safety nets, social insurance, and skilling, so that we can create both the purchasing power amongst rural poor, as well as support healthier food demand. But what this essentially ends up doing, so social protection helps to stimulate the multiplier effect. That is, it stimulates demand for healthy foods. It supports adaptive capacities in the face of high frequency and more intense shocks. And it can be used to tailor and guarantee nutritious consumption of the poor and by the poor, right? So action area 4, use markets as a driver for inclusive and sustainable food systems. What the Rural Development Report is essentially asking us to do is to think about using market-based incentives and instruments such as gradation, such as standards, such as regulation, so that we can strengthen local and regional production. The focus on going local is really key in the RDR, and something that I find extremely, extremely challenging and very, very interesting, and a huge value add of the Rural Development Report. The second is markets can also be used to help diversify diets and make healthier food choices by both price incentives, non-price incentives, as well as other instruments such as labeling, such as standards. And we are also saying that we should be supporting and developing legal and regulatory regimes to support affordable food prices for nutrient-dense foods. Action area 5 of 6 is reflect the true cost of production. I think you're hearing this in the overall food system debate. The total value of food that is produced globally is estimated at $10 trillion. But guess what? It's priced currently at $8 trillion. that $1.9 trillion that is left behind, that is not accounted for in the price, is essentially the externalities. So if you look at the right-hand side, the graph that I put up, and the red circle around it, that's the cost of the negative externality that we are having to bear as a consequence of current production systems and practices. And that's not getting priced in the current global food system. And that's why we've got to correct it. We can do that by removing distortions in trade and as well as in markets, but also with an explicit focus on moving away from unhealthy as well as ultra-processed foods. We're also saying that globally, society, governments, multilateral agencies should be thinking about paying for this global good that small-scale producers are typically much well suited to producing with respect to ecosystem services as well as carbon sequestration services that do get ignored when we are thinking about pricing goods that are produced by small-scale producers. Action area 6, and that's the last one. Make healthier food affordable and accessible for rural people. Currently, the cost of a diet that meets food-based dietary guidelines, or FBDG, is between $3.3 and $4.5 per day. Think about what we think is the poverty line. And you can see that there's a huge mismatch between what we are expecting in terms of nutritious uptake and just what the poverty line is currently pegged at. So that clearly needs to change if we want people to think about moving to nutritious foods. Healthy diets are unaffordable currently for more than 3 billion people. Within this, we're recommending that, yes, there be an increase in incomes and transfers that can help to lead to healthier choices. There is a responsibility for meta-level actors such as governments, international spaces, etc., to nudge consumer choices towards making it easier for them to take on informed dietary decisions. There's also a role for strengthening market access and rural-urban linkages. And last but not least, it's really important to think about enhancing women's decision-making ability, both through income as well as through non-income choices, because finally, they are most responsible for intra-household nutrition decisions. Overall, ladies and gentlemen, and that's towards the end of my presentation, I think what we are saying is our food systems need to be disrupted to correct power imbalances. We've got to focus on local production systems, local labor markets, and local midstream businesses as a way to help disrupt the current food system that we are witnessing. And we've got to hold governments and businesses responsible for nudging nutrition decisions, for measurement, for standards, and for transparency and accountability. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Puri, for that very comprehensive summary of the findings. If you have any specific questions about that presentation, Dr. Puri will be joining us again for the Q&A portion, so hold on to your questions. We will now move on to our panel discussion, and we have a stellar lineup of expert speakers who were deeply involved in the research and writing of this report. They're going to be discussing the key themes and really drill down on what needs to be done to achieve food system transformation. I'm going to introduce the speakers in alphabetical order in terms of their first names. Now, I apologize in advance if I mangled your names. We have Dr. Inga Brouwer, who is the Associate Professor at the Division of Human Nutrition and Health at Wageningen University. Jim Woodhill, an independent consultant and specialist in global food security, inclusive agribusiness, and multi-stakeholder partnerships. We have Joost Geit, who is the knowledge manager at Wageningen University, whose work focuses on developing more inclusive ways of doing agribusinesses. We then have Ken Giller, who is the professor of plant production systems at Wageningen University, and his research has focused on smallholder farming systems in sub-Saharan Africa. And last, but definitely not the least, we have Romina Kavatassi, who is the lead natural resource economist at IFAD. So how this is going to work is that I'm going to ask a few round of questions to our speakers. I have a lot of questions prepared, but I would actually really like this to be a discussion. So I would really encourage the panelists to respond to each other's answers and build on them. And if you want to speak, after a colleague of yours have spoken, just raise your hand like this, and then, I'll bring you into the discussion. Now, for the audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box to send them. And also, please identify yourself and your organization. We will get to them during the Q&A portion of the event. Now, I'm going to start by asking all of our speakers to summarize the key messages and themes in this report. Dr. Puri did a great job just now giving this overall view, but I would really like them to set the scene on what the current problems and challenges are and how to solve them for their particular expertise areas. And if possible, I'd also like them to take no more than 2 minutes each to answer this question. Ken, I'm actually going to start with you first, because your expertise in rural poverty and production issues, I think, would set the scene perfectly for everybody to follow. Would you like to go?
Well, thanks very much. And I must say, it's been a real privilege to work with IFAD on this report. So my work focuses very much on what we call then action area 1 in Joe Puri's talk, and thanks for that introduction, that basically we need to feed an extra 1 billion mouths by 2030. So that essentially means a real focus on production still within the planetary boundaries, of course, and that means then trying not to have further expansion of land under agriculture. Now that's then both a challenge, but at the same time, it's the greatest opportunity given the importance of small-scale farmers in the global food system. And given that most rapid population growth is occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, where the crop yields are often only a quarter or as low as a tenth of what can be produced, there's the opportunity. But this leads to what I call the food security conundrum. So we have this growing demand for cheap and nutritious food for the burgeoning urban and rural population. That's part of the opportunity. Agriculture is key as a source of income for rural smallholders and their food, as well as being a major contributor to the balance of payments for African economies. So another part of the opportunity. But at the same time, the incentives for farmers to produce, even though they depend on agriculture, are really hardly there because they lack sufficient land or the economic incentives to invest in agriculture. So that's the challenge. On the one hand, the opportunity to produce more cheap and nutritious food. On the other hand, that the smallholder farmers, the rural households, are often, if you like, between a rock and a hard place in terms of trying to produce that. So small farms, depleted soils are what we call then a double poverty trap. And that's, from my perspective, the key issue to address at the base of the global food system. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ken, for fitting so many of the key issues in just 2 minutes. Appreciate that. But that's a great scene setter to talking about both the opportunities and the challenges. And now I'm going to turn to Inga, because obviously nutrition is a big issue, both under and over, all forms of malnutrition. What are the key issues and solutions here?
Yes, thank you, Thin, for giving me the floor to talk about healthy diets, because that's a perspective I focused on in my contribution to this rural development report. And it's by purpose that it's also the first chapter. So in general, we must realize that many people are just eating too little or too much, or they eat the wrong types of food. And this problem is really context specific and depends on who you are, where you live, what you do, and why you do what you do. And although the poorest persistently suffer from periods of hunger and shortage of food, and they lack consistent access to diverse, safe, and nutritious foods, we have to realize that there are other poor population groups, and that's not only urban population, that's definitely also the rural population, that are rapidly shifting to consuming diets with excess calories or saturated fats or sugar or salt or just foods that do not support optimal health and nutrition. So the challenge is this double or triple burden of nutrition that we have to address. So we know that these poor diets are the major driver. So we really have to address that. And if we want to do that seriously, if we want to really to achieve a sustainable, healthy diet for all, means that we have to change our paradigm and start thinking from the consumer and what she eats and the diet gap that exists where she lives and what is needed from the food system to enable her to make a healthy choice. And that's what we call reverse thinking, and that we have introduced in the reports. We need to ensure that consumers have the means and the desire to have a healthy diet and to have nutritious food. And I think that's the main issue that I would like to raise here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Inga. Very interesting. Reverse thinking. Instead of looking at from the production side, to look at it from the consumption side. I'm going to move on to Jim, who's the middle speaker and whose expertise is on midstream employment. Jim, would like to hear your thoughts.
Thin, and good afternoon to everybody. And like Ken, it's been a real privilege to be able to work with IFAD on this fascinating and really, really important report. So let me say a little bit about the midstream. And when we say the midstream, we basically mean all of that business activity that goes on from when food leaves the farm through processing, transporting, storage and retailing till it ends up on our plate as consumers. Now, this midstream is of critical importance in the issues we're talking about in the Rural Development Report for three main reasons. I mean, first one, quite obviously, it's what connects what farmers produce to consumers. If the midstream isn't working well, then farmers don't have markets for their products, or they don't get a good price for their products, or they don't get the inputs they need. And as consumers, we don't get the sort of healthy, sustainably produced food on our plates that we need. The second really critical reason is that at least 20% of people in rural areas actually work and earn their income from the midstream. But further, the midstream is really important in driving the wider rural economy and all the other economic and employment opportunities that come from that. And thirdly, the midstream creates really important economic opportunities for women's economic empowerment and for creating new enterprise and employment and livelihood opportunities for youth. So it's really fundamental. The thing to realise is that over the last 20 odd years or so, the amount of food moving from rural areas to urban areas has increased by something like 1,000% or more. So there's a huge shift in food happening from rural to urban areas. And most of that in low and middle income countries is being done by micro, small and medium scale enterprises. In Africa, there's something like 25 million micro enterprises and more than 1 million small and medium scale enterprises. And that creates all sorts of enterprise opportunities for rural households. But there's also some really big challenges for the midstream in terms of poor infrastructure, difficult regulations, lack of access to finance. So there's a tremendous opportunity here, but also some big challenges that we're going to have to think very carefully about in terms of the policy solutions.
Thanks very much, Jim. That was very, very interesting. Thanks for both defining what midstream employment mean and also quantifying how crucial actually, all of that is. I'm going to now turn to Joost to talk about key messages when it comes to trade and governance issues.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Tin. And indeed, I've learned an enormous amount from this report personally, and I find it, it's extremely fascinating just to actually look at what the evidence shows, as my colleagues have been sharing, that are turning our mind around about how to look at things. If we look at trade, to start with trade, one of the things we certainly has been highlighted, for example, with COVID, and that's, there's plenty of further backing evidence, is that a form of open trade is very important from a perspective of food security. Certainly, as we go into a world that there is increasing variability in terms of climate production, in terms of social unrest, market instabilities, etc., trade is a way of ensuring that there is stability of affordable food, of contributing to the stability of that affordable food for both urban and rural areas. At the same time, trade needs to be organized in such a way that it doesn't actually block the kinds of objectives that Joe and my colleagues have been saying here, that trade actually can incorporate the standards for greater environmental stability and for social equality that are necessary for food systems going towards the future. Now, that leads to governance as being essential in making the kinds of choices and setting the kinds of priorities that Ken, Inge, and Jim have been talking about. And we need to shift to governance which has a much broader base. At the moment, governance and choices in food systems are dominated often by few or one small parties, and we need a much wider voice that represents the needs, such as we've just heard, shaping the choices that are made in governance. And that needs to be backed up with transparency and accountability mechanisms so that these choices actually do get delivered on, these change choices do get delivered on as we desire.
Great, thanks so much, Joost. And we're definitely going to talk about this, power imbalance that you just mentioned in our next question, which I think is such an important aspect and issue that we need to discuss. But I'm going to now turn to Romina. Romina, we've heard from other speakers on all the different aspects, just most recently from Joost on trade and governance, but we've also heard about production, poverty, nutrition, and employment. Can you give us, a sense of what does this mean, overall for the environment and natural resources?
Sure. Thank you very much then for the question. And like my colleagues, I'm thrilled that RDR is seeing light today. It's been a fascinating long journey, but also I learned a lot. So regarding your question, certainly the key insight of the food system approach that we have taken in the report, and which has been articulated by the other speakers, and we have articulated in the report, is that we have to see things interlinked. We have to make actions and make decisions in an integrated way. And it's very important because what we do today will have impacts for generations to come. Now, let's talk about the high cost and spillover effects that have led to high environmental costs that Jo has highlighted in her presentation. And let's focus on the fact that agricultural production alone contributes to about 24 to 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the whole food system to 37% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's an enormous amount. And this adds to pollution, water shortages, land degradation, and loss of biodiversity. Again, thinking about Joe's presentation, we focus on three crops only, which makes up about 60% of the food we eat. So a very narrow type of diet. Of course, climate and environmental degradation pose the most and highest cost on those that are more vulnerable. And among those that are more vulnerable are people that live in rural areas that make most of their life out of agriculture or food system in general, particularly rain-fed agriculture. Now, rural people are the most vulnerable, but they are a key source of solution. They can represent the solution, but they need our support to be the solution. We need to think that at least 30% of global farmland is managed by small-scale farmers with less than 20 hectares. And in low and middle-income countries, that share is higher. Now, enabling them to play a central role in improving the environmental footprint of food production is a key message we'd like to share with you. And one important thing is that it is important to distinguish whether they are farming and have access to very small plots of land, less than 1 hectare or 2 hectares, versus 10 or 20 hectares of land. So solutions need to be tailored, taking this into account, as well as taking the food system type in the country in which they live. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Romina. And thanks also, for emphasizing, we always hear about agriculture contributing to, a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. But now that we're talking about a systems thinking, right, talking about food systems, not just farming, I think it's really important to also talk about the other number, which is the fact that more than a third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food systems. Now, I've got the next question, which has if you've been listening carefully earlier, you would know that this is about tackling and correcting power imbalances. You know, Dr. Puri touched on this issue in her presentation, and I think by the sounds of it, we all agree that, you know, there is a massive disparity between the rural food producers and the rest of the actors in the food system in terms of access, influence, and resources. Power is concentrated in a few hands, and it's definitely not in the hands of people in rural areas. So how can we tackle and correct that? That is my question to you all. And I would like, Joost, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you, because I think when we talk about trade and governance, you know, that is one area where I think this imbalance is quite tangible and glaring as well.
Okay, so let me have a first stab at this. So when in the governance, we certainly have that there's well, as I mentioned, that there's a strong concentration in monopolies or a few players who actually dominate the kinds of choices that we make. So the food systems, they work for those dominant players. Let's not forget, you know, 6 billion people do get fed most days. So it does actually work for quite a few people. The problem is that those for whom it structurally does not, food systems do not work, do not have the ability to influence the choices. So if we're talking about balancing power, we need to be investing in mechanisms and in capabilities so that these unmet groups actually really do have voice and influence about how decisions are made. So there's an investment in partnerships to a certain extent, or importantly, but those partnerships also need to be mandated. They need to have power to actually influence the kinds of choices, the investments, the regulations that we make, and not just be talk shops. There also will be conflicts resulting from this, and there need to be safe spaces for conflict so that one party can actually hold another party accountable to their promises, or can actually challenge certain actions in a safe way, and therefore force or push a system to actually look at how it's operating and where it's headed to. I'll leave a little space, because I'm sure colleagues have a lot to add. Great,
thank you for starting that discussion. Now, who would like to go next? Is there anyone in particular who'd like to volunteer, or I'm very happy to also ask whoever to want to come in. Ken, would you like to try it? Oh, Inga volunteered. I love it. I love it when speakers volunteer. So I'm going to actually call on Inga. Ken, I'll come to you later.
Yes, thank you. I think these power imbalances are really important, and we have to remember that poor diets are actually originating from processes of exclusion, where groups and population groups and also individuals are excluded from access to nutritious diets. So, and I would like to raise two important groups that need to be addressed. And one are the women, and we know already for a long time that it's important to empower women, because that will ensure healthy diets for the whole household. And it's a bit a pity that we have to continue to beat that drum every time again. And the next group we need to focus on is actually the youth. One side, because the youth is really under influence of their food environment and what is sold around them, also in rural areas. And we need to protect them, you know, for, let's say, bad influences, to stop their shift to, let's say, the wrong types of foods. And on the other side, we also need to mobilize them, because it's a very strong force as a producer in rural areas, but also as a consumer to make this shift towards healthy diets. And
Thank you.
I'm sure that Ken would like to react on that as well.
Yeah, Ken?
Well, I can only agree, of course, Inge. A point I'd like to make, though, is that when we're talking about rural households, smallholder farmers in rural households, we have to recognize as well that many of those households actually derive 40, 50, 60% or more of their income from outside the farm. And I think we have to, in our food systems approach, I think we're all convinced that a food systems approach is powerful. We shouldn't forget that the food system is part of the global economic and political system. So when we're talking about power imbalances, I think we have to recognize that then the democratic voice, if you like, of the rural poor is marginal, and that it's basically then something that I think IFAD has a big role then to play with the governments of countries to make sure that these issues are actually raised not only from below but also from the top. That there's more voice, if you like, given to recognize these problems and then to try and address them.
Thank you, Ken. Jim and Romina, who want to go first? Both of you are happy to speak. Shall I ask Romina, ladies first, and then Jim, maybe you can sort of wrap up the discussion for this topic, no pressure.
Yeah, let me go first. Thanks. Well, my colleagues have already raised a lot of issues that I would have raised as well. So, for example, on women, youth, indigenous people as well, they are the custodians of a large part of land, and they do tend to produce in a very sustainable way. And I do agree also with Ken that IFAD can play and is playing an important role both in supporting these types of solutions that are multi-focused. So it's not just looking at production and as mentioned earlier, also in the presentation that Joe gave, switching towards more knowledge-based, adaptive and sustainable production system. We are making a contribution there. But also I'd like to build upon the aspect and the importance of working with the policymakers, for example, contributing and influencing the nationally determined contribution on climate, or interacting with them in defining the country strategies, where we can also act, building upon the reverse thinking that Inge has raised earlier. A lot can be done also from the demand side, because influencing consumers and making them more aware of the nutrient values of food, of how unhealthy ultra-processed foods can be, through labeling, through raising awareness, through capacity building, that can play a quite important role, and that can also be something where we can act upon.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Thank you all. Let me try and draw a couple of threads together and the sort of link between the local and the global. And coming back to Joe's introduction to this, I mean, in terms of the empowerment issues, obviously at a local level, helping farmer groups to work together, women's groups to work together, building that coalitions between groups is a really important part of empowerment. But there's also really simple things to do. I mean, if we recognise that power is often related to simply having wealth, putting good infrastructure into rural areas so rural communities and rural people have more wealth and more power is one very practical thing. But one of the things that I think this rural development report does quite strongly is link these issues of local rural issues into the much bigger global agenda of what's happening in our total food system, how are incentive mechanisms working, how are trade incentives working. And I think it asks or opens up the question around how do we tackle some of those bigger global context setting issues that then have this dramatic influence on what's happening in rural areas. And of course, there's a huge global discussion that we need to have around these sorts of issues and trying to work out how we cope with some of the trade-offs. And a lot of the problems we're dealing with now are because of good meaning policies and incentives in the past that are no longer appropriate for the sort of food system we need for the future. But unfortunately, power gets locked into those past policies and incentives, and we've got to find the ways of sort of working past those through the sort of interactive dialogue, working with each other approaches that Joost has mentioned.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I just wanted to, before we move on to the last round of question, I just wanted to see if anybody else like to sort of respond to any of the points. Romina, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add that one other key leverage to balance the playing field is also innovation, and is also investments in digital technologies. And even for those, we need to be very careful in bringing those to the rural poor and to women, youth, and indigenous people that had mentioned before, because that could create an additional imbalance, and we don't want that. So we need to make sure that these types of innovation and new technologies are also brought to the people that are producing and are consuming.
That's a great point. I know that technology is very exciting and innovation is very exciting, but there are concerns that they might actually widen the digital divide rather than, close it if it is not done well. Anybody else have any more reflections before we move on to the next question? Okay, so let's go on to the last round, the one more round of questions to the speakers. So we've now heard, from you what the problems are, what the solutions can be, and how to tackle this big challenge of an uneven playing field. We also know that IFAD's mandate is around supporting smallholder farmers. Now, given all that you have said so far, what do you think are the implications for IFAD's work? And for that, actually, Romina, I'm going to start with you because you actually work for IFAD, and then I'm hoping other speakers can then add to your comments.
Thank you. Interesting question. Well, what we have articulated in the RDR refers to several processes that are already occurring within IFAD and also externally to IFAD. Let me bring up some which I think are perhaps more relevant, more interesting. One is blended finance. I think financing is one of our foremost tools for leveraging change, and changes in the way we finance food system can play a key role in correcting power imbalances that we were discussing before. Blended finance involves the use of different types of financing sources and instruments to finance investments that have both commercial, but we also want social, environmental, and health return, nutrition return. One of the most promising for agricultural transformation, which IFAD is already using, has been using for a few years, is blending with climate finance. And in such a context, the combination of grants, concessional loans, and resources that are coming also from other funds can provide adequate incentives to achieve broader and desired results. Connected to the blended finance is also taking the view from both the demand and supply side of food production and consumption. So not thinking about them separately or addressing them separately, but in conjunction, because there are a lot of trade-offs, but also synergies that can be used. And in doing this, of course, thinking about the objectives related to environment, climate, also social, so women, youth, indigenous people. And finally, nuancing our vision on the role of smallholder farming in escaping poverty. Not all of them can be able to escape poverty only farming. We need a more nuanced approach. So we've talked about the midstream, we've talked about off-site opportunity when they have very little resources, also social protection mechanisms that can also be transformative. So we need a broader way, a broader view of the potential for diversifying livelihoods. And in a lot of the investments that IFAD support and intervention that we support, there is a broad theory of change that address productive opportunities, not only from agriculture, but also from the midstream, in equipping farmers with the knowledge, with the awareness, but also with the technicalities they need, and also access to finance and technology. So I think this broader view is also an important aspect that we are already addressing, and that is one way of one solution to the problems we're seeing in the food system.
Thank you, Romina. To the other outside experts, you work very closely with IFAD. Okay, Ken and Jim has already raised their hands. Ken by a fraction of a second, so I'm going to go to Ken first, and then I'll come to Jim.
Yeah,
Ken?
so I mean, I absolutely agree with what Romina says, and I think it's great that we're looking at this much more nuanced approach. I think very often people say to me, well, what do we need to do? You name one thing, and that's just not helpful. I mean, it's not one thing. I mean, we're dealing with, we talk about 3 billion small-scale farmers. That's 40% of the world's population in all of their diversity across, particularly across developing countries. And so it really is an and situation rather than an either or. When it comes to the production side, I think we've got a great amount of technical knowledge, but I think there again, we need to escape from saying, you have to do this and you have to use organic or agroecology or this or that. I mean, obviously, we've got to do the best for the environment, the best for people and their incomes. And we need that built into this idea of having multi-layered interventions in terms of policy. It's not just doing something at one level, it's actually working across all of those different levels. I mean, I think we can be optimistic because I think we know what the issues are now, you know, I think certainly from this report, but I mean, the solutions, it's not going to be flicking one switch and having an answer tomorrow. I mean, we've got to engage with what are very thorny and potentially intractable problems in a tailored way to different localities.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, it needs time and patience, right? Jim?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the launch of this report comes between the launch a few months ago of the United Nations World Social Report and the UN Food System Summit in a couple of days' time. The World Social Report made very clear that the scale of rural poverty and inequality is not getting better, and there remains a huge issue there, which is a big problem for everybody. And of course, that sits right in the middle of IFAD's heartland. But then, of course, the connection between that challenge and food systems is what's really important. So I think this whole connection between tackling rural poverty and inequality and broader food systems really sets up IFAD with an incredibly important global agenda setting need, if you like. And within that, then really trying to get a much more nuanced understanding, as Ken and Romina have said, about who in what areas is suffering, what sort of hunger, what sort of poverty, what are the conditions around that, which comes back very strongly to what Joe was talking about the need for local solutions. We have to understand different households, different localities, the solutions that work that, and build the local capacities for those local solutions to be developed, but with a much stronger framework behind that, particularly at the national level and then at the global level, to support that sort of cascading local activity.
Thanks, Jim. Inga, I saw that you raised your hand. So Joost, by default, you'll have to go last. Inga. I think you are still on mute, Inga.
No, I'm not on mute.
Yeah. Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, yes. So I learned a lot actually by writing this chapter, especially together with all my colleagues here, to listen to their arguments, to listen to problems in that specific area. So I think this multidisciplinary discussion and communication is really important. Also for IFAD to widen up to get a better picture of what the food system entails and how it influences rural smallholders as well. So I think it's important not to only talk about what can be done to improve the situation, but we are actually focusing on the transformation. So thinking about how could we establish the transformation and what is needed to really change food systems towards the direction that we needed is an important issue that's not, I would say up till now, discussed a lot. So in short, we know what we do. I mean, there are many important issues described and discussed today. But the question is how? I mean, how do we build coalitions between the unusual collaborators? How do we influence policies to, give pressure to the persistent powers in a food system to change? How do we give room to diversity of solutions in a food system? Is an important issue that we still have to tackle.
Great. Thanks, Inga. Yeah, really interesting talking about coalitions and cooperation, and it's also particularly with the Food System Summit. There's been a lot of coalitions being formed on all these different areas, and it'll be really interesting to see what comes up in the future. Joost?
Yeah, so I'm not going to answer all of Inga's how questions because if I did, I would well, I could retire. But what I think what I'm hearing everyone saying, and what I also see in the report is also bringing really the value and the importance of bringing that system perspective to all the things that we're doing. So that leads indeed us away from thinking of single problem, single solution, or single approach mentalities to be doing the kind, the what Ken was saying as the and also what Romina was starting to bring in about broadening the kind of investment space that is relevant to tackling food systems and the desired outcomes of food systems, and through that, decent lives and stable livelihoods. So things like investing in not only investing we're familiar with often in individual in direct production, but investing indeed in the capacities of within a government to work across ministries and start analyzing now where are there perverse incentives. Jim mentioned old policies which often don't allow the kind of change to happen, so that subsidies stimulate a lot of production around calorie-rich fat and oil-rich products, and prevent investments in nutrient-rich products, such as Inge is also stimulating for, and investing in governance capabilities and in voice is equally necessary and legitimate in terms of food system transformation as investing in the more direct production and processing things, which are also essential. So it's very much indeed and bring in the spaces of attention and investment that we have been ignoring by not looking at things from a systems point of view.
Great, thanks so much, Joost. We still have a couple of minutes that I actually want to take and throw this out to everyone. Anybody else want to answer some of Inge's questions on the how? Joost has touched on some of them. Is there anybody else who wants to sort of try and tackle that, or if there's any other points that you want to sort of emphasize that maybe we might not have discussed about in the last few minutes? Does anybody want to chime in or say anything? Ken?
Maybe if it's a parting shot, I guess. I mean, what I'd really like to say is, people often say, yeah, but it all sounds so difficult. It all sounds so complex. But I mean, we have to face up to the fact that we are dealing with really, really important problems, that we need to grapple with them. And I don't think people should be frightened of grappling with them. I mean, I think we've got very good examples of local successes and solutions which can be replicated and can be built, but it needs, if you like, the engagement from governments at the top right down to people at the bottom, and really right across the board. So I just say, don't be frightened, just let's get on with it. Yeah.
I think that is actually a great parting shot. Joost, do you have anything to add?
I want to add, broad-based engagement in these kind of problems is indeed an opportunity. It shouldn't be seen as a threat. It's not threatening established powers, but it's really an opportunity to be serving, long-term interests of everybody's interests, rather than short-term interests of only a few.
That's great. Thanks. Jim, I saw you. Yeah.
I mean, maybe coming back to your business then, I think at one level, we have to really be thinking about how you drive the wider societal understanding that making these changes is in everybody's interest. We can't just focus in rural areas. We have to get the whole of society understanding this and putting on the political pressure. And that's why these sort of engagements, and I think the work that the UN Food System Summit's doing and the tremendous dialogues that it's generated all around the world are so important.
That is a great point, right? One of the things we always talk about, I think, when we're talking about, advancing women's rights, is to find male champions who will champion that. And I think the same with rural as well, to get the whole world to sort of buy in and understand it. Romina, last one before we have to go.
Yeah, just last words. I'd like to say, to build upon, the complexity of things, that is true. But if you have an intervention that is broad enough and consider all the intricacies, we can support, and each one of us, IFAD as an institution, and each one of us that work for this for these objectives at large can make a contribution. And if we contribute all, we can achieve desired results. Another thing is that there is a lot of discussion around food system. What is very important, and I'd like as a point to be taken from this discussion today, is that we must move from food system that deplete to food system that protect ecosystem services. But we must do this in a way that enhances rural livelihoods and nutrition, and it should not be done on the back of the rural poor, because they run the risk of being forgotten.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's a great key takeaway before we move on to the next session. I would have I would have been very happy to let this go on for another hour, but we're going to have to wrap up this panel discussion so that we can move on to the next parts of the event. Now, before we open up to Q&A, we have reactions to the panel discussion that you just heard from two key groups of stakeholders, government and farmers themselves. Now, first, we have His Excellency, Dr. Miguel Jorge Garcia Winda, who is the permanent representative of Mexico to the United Nations agencies in Rome. Your Excellency, you've spoken extensively in debates around food systems, and looking ahead to the summit now, the Food System Summit in 2 days' time. How does today's discussion and what you've heard resonate with you? And what do you think this mean in terms of the commitments that we could see from member states with respect to transforming food systems? If I could request Your Excellency to keep your reflections to about a maximum of about 4 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Late, and thank you to the President Combo and Dr. Puri for inviting me to talk about this subject. And let me start. I may not be the best person to talk about this subject because I have my personal doubts about this subject. Of course, everything today has a last name, and the last name is transformation of food systems, which in occasions I think could hide the importance of some problems around this national dialogue. But I have two starting points. The first starting point is I don't believe we can transform the food systems if we do not transform our rural territories. And I think that's a very important question. Is how do we transform the rural territories? And I think one of the previous speakers already indicated that many of the farmers, smallholder farmers, have a lot of income that comes outside agriculture. So I believe that this report should provide some evidence and should provide some guidance for us to start thinking outside the box and start putting agriculture as only one of the potential sectors that can help us to transform the rural environment. If we don't think about the rural environment as a whole, we are in the risk of leaving solutions or providing only partial solutions. We have heard about the importance of stopping over-processed foods, but we need to think that in the context of the entire rural milieu. So I believe that in order to transform the food system, we have to create a new conception of a rural world. Sometimes I believe that many of us want to have a very romantic idea. I want to maintain the rural milieu in the same way it is, but in reality, the forces are moving ahead of us, and we need to catch up with this transformation. We are going to have less people in the rural areas. We have more intermediary cities. So we need to start thinking, and hopefully this report can provide some of this. The second point that I want to make is, what is this report good for? When I was Undersecretary of Agriculture, I met with tens of farmers' organizations and probably hundreds, if not thousands, smallholder farmers. And many of them just came to us and said, we need cheap credit, cheap financial services for us to develop. So I hope this report can help governments, can help IFAD to develop strategies so we can bring finance to the smallholder farmers at a lower rate so they can truly take advantage of the resources they need to invest in the technology and the productivity that they need. And I was very surprised in the presentation that there were two things that I didn't hear. The investment in infrastructure. I think we need to invest in infrastructure, and the investment on public goods, roads, warehousing, irrigation systems, and water management. And I still believe that those that are the stepstones of agriculture need to be considered. So my hope is that this report will allow us to transform the way we think about the rural territories, to allow us to transform IFAD intervention at the country and regional level, and will inform the government so the governments can create finance mechanisms that are cheap, effective, and transparent for smallholder farmers. There are many things to talk about this project, about this report. And thank you so much for all your work, and I hope to see you in person again one of these days.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your reflections. Very interesting, and thanks for pointing out, the two things that you didn't hear, but you were really interested in. Maybe later on in Q&A we can discuss that. Now, before moving on to our next reaction, just wanted to remind everyone that you can actually send questions through the Q&A box. Please do identify yourself and your organization if possible, and then we'll try and get to them after this reaction. I'm now going to bring in Olivier Muvandimwe, who is from the Rwanda Youth in Agribusiness Forum. I understand, Olivier, you are yourself a farmer. I just want to hear from you, Olivier. The issues that you have heard from just now from the panel, are they similar to the ones that are facing young people in your forum? And if you could also talk about, some of the most important issues that are facing young people working in food systems in Rwanda today, and if there are any issues that we haven't raised yet today, like what the ambassador suggested just now, it would also be great.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, the issue that has been mentioned, that most of the farmers in sub-Saharan Africa faces, the same issues that most of the youth in Rwanda faces, but particularly the youth cluster is much more vulnerable than the other cluster because of different factors. But the challenges that they face cannot be generalized because. For example, for the youth who are in the primary productions, like in the primary productions, crop production and livestock face the various challenges. For example, on access to land, you have had some issues that most of the youth faces: access to land, limited access to land. But if you look to the cluster of primary production or livestock productions, the issues are concentrated on the part. The other issues are faced by the people in the agro-processing. Then in agro-processing, you can find that people it is very hard for the youth to start the business, to venture into business because of the limited capital, but mostly attributed to the limited knowledge on how to access financial literacies. And also you can find the qualities, the program of qualities, because they don't have knowledge, skills on quality assurance. Then if your product doesn't have a quality, access to market is a challenge for that. And then also you in other clusters of the people in agro services mostly face the challenge of unemployment. Unemployment because of what? Because the knowledge, the skills does not respond to the actual issues that most of farmer faces. And this is the concentrations, because sometimes the youth cannot have an access to knowledge and access to information, or an access to depend on their background from their rural areas. Specifically, I like the introduction for this. Those people who feed us are always hungry, because there is disparities between the producers and the rest of the people in a food system or in the value chain environment. So whenever you descend from agro processing up to the primary productions, the cost of productions become the income, the revenue that you get from the production just reduces. So the same case happened to the youth, especially for those one who are in the primary production. Then there is another cluster, emerging cluster of the youth in the ICT for agriculture. Currently, ICT adoption is very good because it can increase innovation to the productions side, to the marketing side, to the all the chains. But adoption still is a problem because it is a new system and new technology that most of the youths are not easy to understand easily. All the farmers are not easy to adopt it. So it's become for a challenge for the youth who can bring innovations, such a kind of innovations in agriculture or in agribusiness because of such criteria, such parameters of and adaptability of the farmer to the new technologies. So also that is a challenge. So, but basically, if you look at to the government interventions, all the programs that have been raised has gotten. I would like to see whether in the full report there is such a success stories from the country to countries, because for example, in a country in Rwanda, last year's in 2018, they have started the National Agriculture Transformation Strategies, which encompasses everything that I've covered. From the innovation and extension, we have the building of the new system of production that will increase the productions, bringing the new varieties, disease resistance varieties, bringing such a technology on innovation on extensions so that the farmer can really understand. So this is the way, if you go to the farmers, to the youth, this is the way we are just trying to penetrate as the forum. And then if you go
Sorry,
to
Olivier. We're running out of time, so it would be great. I don't want to interrupt, but it would be great if you can wrap it up very soon.
Okay. So if we go to the second priority area, you find productivity and resilience. You talked about the productivity, the climate smart agriculture, all the technology that can conserve environment sustainably while giving you productions. So this is the innovation, the policy there, but the challenges on the implementation of this. So IFAD, I would recommend that this is the part where the youth are trying to invade, because it doesn't require access to land, but bringing innovations, bringing technologies so that agriculture production can be sustainable. So most of the intervention should be just focusing on that. Primate smart agriculture especially for the youth, because it's kind of just, this is the scope where the youth, most of the youth can fall in and ensure that the challenges that they have across the value chains are faced. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivier. Sorry to interrupt, but we do have to go to Q&A. I think what Olivier just said sort of underlines some of the presentation that Dr. Puri made right at the beginning as well about, challenges and things, solutions needing to be local, because it's so hard to generalize, and they need to be specific to the needs. We now have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and can we ask our panelists, our expert speakers from the discussion panel, and Dr. Puri onto the screen so that we can get them to answer the questions. So a couple of questions have come in. They actually have a similar theme, looking at essentially touching on the whole, concentration of power and uneven playing field. I will ask one question this is from Ruchi Tripathi, who said, how can we encourage and build from the ground up, from, for example, women food producers and farm workers, and get big business out of food systems to make them more resilient and equitable? And a second question was also along the same themes about how big agribusinesses are pushing a highly industrialized agriculture model that is inequitable but also environmentally destructive. How can we stop this system from being pushed through? And I also want to pick on a second question, so you can sort of percolate that first question, which is around this inequality. And the second question is about we've talked about the challenges and what needs to be done. In 2 days' time, You know, the world is going to come together to agree on actions to transform our food system. How optimistic are you that we will get the changes to achieve the kind of transformation that we are talking about? So that's the two questions. Who would like to go first? Maybe Dr. Puri, would you, perhaps start with setting the scene, and I'll go into the other speakers.
Thanks, Tin, and thank you very much for excellent questions. I thought there's no way that I'm going to answer all of Ruchi's question, because that's essentially what the RDR is, and that's essentially the big conundrum in front of the entire Food System Summit as well, right? How are we going to make it less unfair? How are we going to make it more efficient? How are we going to make it sustainable? And how are we going to essentially reflect the values that we all hold dear in the food system? But I think there were, especially the discussion, and I want to start with Ambassador Miguel's very good question on, on why I didn't mention, and I should have, and this is partly me being remiss, but definitely not a commentary on the giants that put in work into this report. But when we're talking about accessibility as well as affordability of local production, I think implicit in that, at least in my head, was this idea that especially governments should be looking at, but also international organizations. And that's the second part of my answer. What is the responsibility of international organizations possibly in this space, right? But I think for governments to be providing that kind of infrastructure, both in terms of rural road infrastructure, so for example that, but I think also providing the kind of access which is digital, or providing incentives for taking on newer forms of say, insurance. So digressive insurance is something that IFAD is working on, where governments come in to subsidize 90% in the first year, 75% in the second year, 50% in the third year, and finally farmers only get to pay a full premium in the fifth year. This is an innovation that has been introduced also in the financial space or in the insurance space, right? So these are things that but also building rural roads so that we can incentivize rural markets, reduce transaction costs, and increase efficiencies are clearly part of the deal. I think the big question, at least in my head, is how can we get produce which is essentially local, so neglected and underutilized species, things that are not focused on salt, sugar, carb, and fats. That's what Inga also spoke about. Things that are not focused on that really onto our plates. And one thing that I think we haven't spoken sufficiently about, but that I'm really keen to try and see as to how international organizations can put forward, is really developing science in this space, is really focusing on evidence on, for example, the use of behavioral science approaches and nudges, right? So whether you change the default choice, I travel on a plane, I actually have to mark a box if I want a vegetarian food item. Otherwise, my default is non-vegetarian. That can change very quickly. This happens, in a country of 1.5 billion people in India, this happens all the time. You change that and you make the default neglected and underutilized species that are grown locally. And guess what? You've got the rural-urban linkage. So change the default, right? And you've got the market. So that's one. Thinking about product placement. Thinking about how we can bring in multiple interventions with behavioral science so that we are thinking about further or greater consumption of fruit and vegetables. I think the science on this is not well known enough. We know too little about how much of a difference it makes in both sales revenue as well as consumption choices for us to essentially scale this up. So I think where international organizations can and should come in is really on developing the evidence and the science on this space and then putting it out there as a global good. So that's the second part. And very quickly, if you permit me, on environmental and social governance and nutrition. I just got off another discussion where we were looking at large corporations, 350 food corporations of the world produce more than half of the global food and agricultural revenue. They employ more than 23 million people and definitely impact a lot of the 500 million small-scale farmers that we are talking about here. We've got to change the global power equation in this space so that they start to look at small and medium enterprises as the source that they go to aggregate. And I think a large part of that could come from blended finance, but blended finance is about grants as well as non-grants, about innovation, taking risk by organizations such as international ones, but also by governments, and then propelling our systems there towards pricing systems that take on externalities. And I think we are not focusing sufficiently, for example, on economic and financial analysis that take on these externalities more explicitly. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dr. Puri. We actually have a bit more questions coming on. So if you don't mind, Ken, could I come to you for that question as well about, how can we actually encourage and build from the ground? Because I think your expertise with poverty reduction and production, just talking about how do we do that. And I want to get very brief answers from you because I do want to get to this question and we are running out of time for one more question, which talks about giving the complexities of the various challenges and the need for localization. How can the Food Systems Summit really motivate change beyond just general principles or global issues? But first, Ken, if you don't mind if I come to you about how do we build from the ground up? And then I'd like to hear very, very briefly from everyone, if possible, for the question that I read out just now, which I'll read again.
So, yeah, I mean, you want me to answer all of these complex questions in 10 seconds. First, I'd like to say, I don't think we should write off, some of the bigger companies, the Unilevers, the Nestlés or whatever are sourcing a lot of their produce from small scale farmers, and they're trying to do it in a very, let's say, in a way which would provide a living income for the producer. And we need them as part of the global trade. And I think they're making at the moment a lot of commitments, many of the big companies making a lot of commitments actually, and they already engage with millions of smallholders. Working from the bottom up, of course, means working locally. And I think, we say, obviously the danger of a meeting like this is we talk in platitudes and it all sounds so general. But we've worked out ways and methods of working together with local communities. There is a lot going on. All I could say is direct you to the report and to actually a lot of the things we say there and the publication cited there, because I think we've got lots of hooks on which to hang our activities for the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. I've just been given a few more minutes from the organizers to tackle, this new question about how can the Food Systems Summit, really motivate change beyond just general principles or global issues. Perhaps, Joost, can I ask you to start that, and then we'll try and get some thoughts from everybody else as well.
I think it's already starting to do an interesting job. I mean, the fact that we've had over 800 food system dialogues that have been sparked by the anticipation of the summit is an example of new kinds of governance. There's been an extensive consultation with several thousand SMEs across the globe about their roles and their needs and their contributions. Again, that's bringing in different perspectives. So in that sense, I think the UN, it's with all the discussion about, how representative is it, and who is there a power concentration also happening here? It is bringing to the fore the food systems as a critical global issue that needs to be collectively addressed globally and down through the levels, right down into the local levels Ken also referred to.
Great, thank you. So, from what you've said, you sound fairly optimistic that, things have moved enough and to a scale that there will be some change. Jim, Romina, Inga?
I'll go first after Joost. I'm an optimist, and I agree with Joost that the fact that we've seen 800 dialogues, and a lot is moving in the field, as the ambassador mentioned earlier. Every surname now is a food system. So it is very important that the dialogues, the conversation are ongoing. There are a lot of coalitions that have just started, are moving forward. and bring in the private sector and what Ken just mentioned, you know, having premiums, for example, for them to buy for local producers, switching the thinking towards a wide variety of crops and species, including underutilized and neglected. It's a lot of things that we can do, and I'm positive that we can. I think the change is already happening. The awareness we have today, we didn't have a decade ago, and I think that can go on, and we should contribute to that, and we can make it.
Thank you, Jim. We can hear you now.
Okay, I've been unmuted by the host now. Thank you. Clearly, the Food Systems Summit has created a tremendous momentum, as others have just mentioned. I think the really key thing that now needs to be focused on to take that momentum forward is getting the incentives right, or what Joe referred to as resetting the default position. And that is going to require some deep policy work at a national level. You can't change that overnight. So we need to think about what's the policy transition pathway we need. And not a country can't do that on its own, because then you don't end up with an equal sort of playing field. So we really need that coordination to try and bring gradual policy change to shift us in the directions. We know what needs to be done. We've now got to get the incentives in place to actually make it happen.
Thank you, Inga. Any thoughts before I went on to the last couple of minutes, where I do have one final question for all of you, but if there's anything you want to add now is the time.
Well, just short is that I'm also optimistic about the food system dialogues. I really enjoyed them. I joined some of the dialogues in country, and it's really amazing how many people are coming together to discuss and to, try to grab this food system thinking and try to proceed. So in some countries, it's really working, and these countries were already the ones that are in the forefront, I would say. But we should not forget about the countries where we do not see these dialogues happening, and think about where or what should we help in these countries to start this kind of discussions going on. And next, I would really pledge for, having commitment, of making commitments to get the thing going. We shouldn't stop after this food system. It's a very good start. But we need to continue and keep the national governments in the driving seat towards the transformation of their food system.
Great. Now, unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up this event in a couple of minutes. But before we do that, I do have one final question, and I would actually like all of our speakers no more than 30 seconds to answer this. I know I've given you a lot of challenges today to answer in a very short, concise manner. I promise you this is the last one. Now, if you have one message, to give to world leaders who are going to be attending the Food Systems Summit in 2 days' time, what would that message be? Just one. Let's start with Dr. Puri.
Prices, prices, prices. Get the price right, we'll get the system right.
Great. Inga?
Well, I would say focus on your food-based dietary guidelines. And if you don't have them, please make an effort to make them, to know what is a healthy food in your country and where the dietary gaps are.
Jim?
I think I said it in my last message. Get the economic incentives right and support countries at a national level to really work on their policy directions.
Joost?
Set up national agendas around food system transformation and really commit to deliver on those with accountability mechanisms backing you.
Ken?
I'd say moving into the COP26, obviously climate change is a huge issue, and we haven't mentioned that here today, and in terms of the uncertainty that gives for producers. But I'd also say that I think alongside climate change, the demographic changes, the rapid population growth in Africa is putting such pressure on rural areas that is something that we really need to raise higher in the international agenda and really tackle as well. Thank you.
And Romina?
Commit to a food system transformation through incentives and mechanisms that are tailored towards respecting the environment, but not on the back of the rural poor.
Thank you very much. And there we have it. I think those make for such a great summary of what we have discussed today. I don't think I could do a better job of summarizing all this very, varied and quite deep discussion that we've had. I think if there's one point that I guess I should emphasize from what I've heard from everyone is the nuance that is needed in trying to tackle this very important, very crucial issue. But like Ken said, it's not something to be afraid of. We just need to get on with it. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Can we give them a virtual round of applause, please? Because they've been fantastic and their insights have been super, super helpful. Thank you also as well to the audience for your participation. It's been an absolute pleasure moderating this event. I wish you all the best for the rest of the week, and goodbye.
Finn, you were fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.